The first time Silas Ralston rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, every man, woman, and child on Main Street found somewhere else to be within 30 seconds flat. Every last one of them, except for a young woman standing outside the general store with a crate of apples balanced against her hip, and an expression on her face that could only be described as mildly curious. Silas noticed it because he noticed everything. That was how a man stayed alive in his line of work. He noticed the way the barber stepped back from his window. He noticed the way the blacksmith let his hammer drop just a little too carefully before retreating inside his shop. He noticed the reverend crossing to the other side of the street with considerably more speed than a man of God had any good reason to muster. And then he noticed her, standing right where she had been standing before he rode in, watching him with those steady brown eyes like he was nothing more remarkable than a passing thundercloud. He was 6'2" and broad across the shoulders, and he wore a black duster that had seen better days and a hat pulled low enough to cast his face in permanent shadow. He had a reputation that traveled faster than he did, which was saying something because Silas Ralston covered ground quickly when he needed to. 3 dead men in Abilene. A bounty hunter left alive in Dodge City only because Silas had decided he was not worth the bullet. A shootout in Wichita that had left 2 of the Decker gang face down in the mud, and Silas walking away with a crease along his left ribs that still pulled tight when the weather changed. People knew his name before they ever saw his face, and when they saw his face, they understood that the stories had not been exaggerated. The young woman with the apples just looked at him. He reined his horse in slowly, because something about being looked at that directly without any fear behind it made him uncertain in a way gunfire never had. His horse, a big roan gelding named Cutter, shifted beneath him and then went still. "You need something?" she asked, and her voice was even, not brave performative even, not trying not to shake even, actually even, like she genuinely had no particular opinion on whether he was dangerous. Silas stared at her. "Water trough," she tilted her head. "Down at the end of the street. You can see it from here if you look past the livery." He looked. He could, in fact, see it from here. "Obliged," he said, and he rode on, and he told himself he did not look back. He looked back. She had already turned her attention back to stacking her apples. His name was Silas Ralston, and he was 28 years old, and he had not been rendered speechless by a single human being since he was 14, and he spent the rest of that afternoon trying to figure out what exactly had just happened to him. The town of Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town sitting right on the Kansas Indian Territory border, which meant it was loud and dusty and full of drovers coming up from Texas on the Kishom Trail with money to spend and a thirst they had been building since Fort Worth. It was also a town with ambitions, which was why it had a real newspaper, a school, a church with an actual bell tower, and a doctor who had trained in St. Louis and had not yet drunk himself entirely out of usefulness. It was not a large town, but it was a real one, and it had the kind of people in it who were trying to build something rather than just survive. Silas had no particular interest in building anything. He had ridden into Caldwell on a job. A man named Fletcher Cade had stolen a strongbox from a Wells Fargo office in Wichita containing $16,000 in railroad bonds, and Wells Fargo was paying $500 for his return, alive, and another $200 for the strongbox. Fletcher Cade had a cousin in Caldwell, which was why Silas was here. He planned to find Fletcher Cade and be out of Caldwell before the week was finished. He had not planned on the woman with the apples. Her name was Violet Monroe, and he learned this without trying because Caldwell was small enough that names attached themselves to faces without any deliberate effort on his part. He heard it at the saloon when he stopped in for a drink that evening. The bartender, a wide man named Harold with a scar over his left eye, gave Silas his whiskey without much in the way of conversation, but the 2 men seated at the bar talking between themselves did not lower their voices enough. "That was Violet Monroe," said the first man. "She was not even afraid." "She is never afraid of anything," said the second man, with the particular tone of a person who finds another person's bravery either admirable or irritating and has not yet decided which. "Remember when that bull got loose from the stockyard last fall? She walked right up to it and took it by the rope. That is different from Silas Ralston. Is it? She seems to think all fear is a choice." Silas drank his whiskey and stared straight ahead at the bottles on the shelf behind the bar, and he did not react to hearing his own name, which was a thing he had trained himself to do long ago. But something about the words settled in him strangely. She seems to think all fear is a choice. He got himself a room at the hotel, which was $3 a week, and came with a bed that was only slightly less comfortable than sleeping on the ground, and he lay awake longer than he should have, which was irritating, because Silas Ralston was a man who slept when he needed to sleep and woke when he needed to wake, and did not spend time in between thinking about things that did not serve any immediate purpose. Violet Monroe did not serve any immediate purpose. He met her properly the next morning, though he had not intended to. He was at the general store to buy supplies, dried beef and coffee, and a new box of cartridges, and she was there behind the counter in an apron, which apparently she worked there most mornings before going to help her mother, which he gathered from the brief and entirely one-sided conversation the woman at the flour barrel was having with her. The store smelled of dried herbs and leather and something sweet he could not identify, and Violet Monroe was writing something in a ledger with the focused expression of a person who did their work seriously. She looked up when he came in. She looked directly at him, the same as she had on the street the day before, and said, "Good morning." "What can I get for you?" Not a single flicker of hesitation. He told her what he needed. She found each item with efficient, unhurried movements, setting them on the counter and writing the cost in a separate column with the same careful handwriting. She wrapped the dried beef in brown paper. She found him the cartridges without having to look for them, which meant she knew where everything was in this store. She had been here a long time, he thought. This was her place. "You are new in town," she said, not as a question, while she added the column. "Passing through," he said. "People usually are," she said pleasantly. "Cattle town. Lot of people pass through." She told him the total. He put the money on the counter. She counted it and made change with the same unhurried precision. He stood there for 1 second longer than was strictly necessary, holding his supplies, and then he said, "Violet Monroe." She looked up again, not surprised that he knew her name. Small town. Of course he had learned her name. "Silas Ralston," she said, and for the first time something shifted in her face, not fear but a recognition of something, like she had been expecting this introduction eventually. "I know who you are." "Most people do," he said, "and most people make themselves scarce," she said. There was not the slightest hint of judgment in it. She was simply observing a pattern. "You did not," he said. She looked at him steadily. She was maybe 23 or 24, he thought, with dark hair that she wore pulled back and eyes that were a very particular warm brown, and there was something in the set of her jaw that spoke of a person who had decided a long time ago exactly who she was and had no intention of revising that. "No," she agreed. "I did not." He waited because there had to be a reason, an explanation, a story. There was always a reason when someone was not afraid of something they should reasonably be afraid of. She seemed to understand that he was waiting. "My father was a man people were afraid of," she said, her voice quieter now but still steady. "And most of what they feared him for was not real. He was a hard man but not a cruel one, and I spent a lot of my childhood watching people treat him like he was something to run from because of how he looked and how he carried himself. It seemed like a waste of perfectly good people." She paused. "That is not a comment on your reputation, which I understand is more substantiated than his ever was. It is just how I learned to think about fear." Silas held on to that for a moment. "Your father," he said, "is he here?" "He died 4 years ago," she said. "Fever." "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it. She studied him, and he had the very strange feeling that she was seeing something in him that other people did not usually stay long enough to see. "So am I," she said. He left the store and he went about his business, which was finding the cousin of Fletcher Cade. The cousin's name was Amos Cade, and he ran a small wagon repair operation on the edge of town, and Silas found him without much difficulty. Amos was a wiry, nervous man in his 40s who flinched the moment he recognized Silas and immediately began talking too fast. "I do not know where Fletcher is," Amos said. "I have not seen him in 3 months. Whatever he has done, I am not part of it." Silas believed him, mostly because Amos was visibly too frightened to lie effectively. He asked a few more questions, learned that Fletcher had been headed south toward the Indian Territory, and left Amos standing in his own doorway clutching a wheel spoke like it might protect him. This changed his timeline. Fletcher Cade in the Indian Territory meant a longer chase than he had planned for, and it meant resupplying and potentially being in Caldwell for several more days, while he gathered better information about which direction Fletcher had gone and whether he had crossed the border yet. He did not examine too carefully whether the extension of his stay had anything to do with a general store and the woman who worked in it. He ate supper at the small restaurant on the ground floor of the hotel, which was run by a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who made a very acceptable beef stew. And while he was eating, Violet Monroe came in with another woman who turned out to be her mother, Clara Monroe. Clara Monroe was a small, fine-boned woman in her mid-50s who had the look of someone who had worked very hard for a very long time and had arrived at a kind of dignified peace with that. She and Violet took a table near the window. Silas was 3 tables away. He ate his stew and did not stare. At some point, Clara Monroe glanced over at him with the careful assessment of a woman who had spent years evaluating threats, and then she leaned toward her daughter and said something in a low voice. Silas could not hear what it was. Violet responded in an equally quiet voice, and Clara Monroe sat back with an expression that was not alarmed, exactly, but was something. They left before he finished his meal. Violet caught his eye on the way out and gave him a brief, contained nod, the kind a person gives an acquaintance, not the careful non-acknowledgement people usually gave him. He nodded back. 3 days passed in that way, him working his investigation and running into Violet Monroe at intervals that felt both inevitable and slightly unnerving. She was the kind of person who was present in her town in a way that some people are, not because she sought attention, but because she was engaged with things. He saw her delivering medicines from the store to an elderly man who could not walk easily. He saw her helping Mrs. Hargrove carry in a delivery of flour that had arrived at the wrong end of the street. He saw her in the early morning reading on the bench outside the general store before it opened, a book held in both hands, completely absorbed. On the 4th day he asked her what she was reading. She looked up at him with that direct gaze. "Middlemarch," she said, "by George Eliot. Have you read it?" "I have not read much of anything in some years," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said to another person in a considerable while. She considered that. "There is a line in it," she said, "about the growing good of the world depending on unhistoric acts and on those who lived faithfully a hidden life. I think about that sometimes out here." She glanced down the dusty street with its saloon noise and cattle smell. "Everyone out here is writing some kind of story for themselves. Not everyone gets to make it a good one." He did not know what to say to that. He was, he realized, consistently in the position of not knowing what to say around her, which was not a position he was accustomed to. "You think a man can change the kind of story he is in?" he asked, and he did not intend it to mean what it meant, but it did anyway. Violet looked at him quietly. "I think people generally become what they keep choosing to become," she said, "which means the choosing matters. Good morning, Mr. Ralston." She went into the store. He stood on the street for a full minute thinking about what she had said. That afternoon, he got better information about Fletcher Cade. A drover who had come up from Texas through the territory said he had seen a man matching Cade's description in a small settlement about 40 miles south of Caldwell, on the Kansas side of the border still, holed up with a woman and spending money freely. Silas would need to leave by early morning and ride hard to get there while the information was still fresh. He should have been glad about this. He should have felt the clean forward motion of a job coming back on track. Instead, he sat on the edge of his hotel bed in the late afternoon and thought about leaving without any particular satisfaction. He was being ridiculous. He was a bounty hunter with a job to do, and Violet Monroe was a woman he had spoken to perhaps 4 times in 4 days and was not his business in any way. He was not a settling man. He was not a man who belonged in a town like this with its school bell and its church and its careful, decent people trying to build something. He was the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid, except that one woman did not. He went back to the general store before supper. He told himself he needed additional coffee. He did not need additional coffee. The store was quieter in the late afternoon, the morning rush of housewives and cattlemen's wives and drovers resupplying long finished. Violet was restocking shelves in the back, and when she heard the door she called out, "One moment," without turning around. When she turned and saw it was him, she did not startle. She just set down her armful of tins and came to the counter. "Coffee," he said. She got him the coffee. While she was wrapping it, he said, "I am leaving tomorrow, early morning." She set the package on the counter. "Did you find what you came for?" "Close enough. Man I am looking for is south of here. I need to move before the trail goes cold." She nodded. There was something in her expression that was difficult to read, and he had become, in 4 days, unreasonably invested in reading her expressions. It was not sadness. It was not the particular disappointment a woman shows a man she has interest in. It was something more complicated. "Be careful," she said. "I usually am," he said. "You have bullet creases on your left side," she said, matter of fact. "I can see the shape of where the coat sits wrong. That is a recent wound within the last few months." He was startled enough to be briefly still. He had not told anyone that. He had not shown it to anyone. "You notice things," he said. "My father taught me to," she said. "He said paying attention to people was the only way to really know them." She looked at him with those steady brown eyes and said, "I know you are wondering why I am not afraid of you, and I know you have been trying to figure out whether there is something wrong with me for not being afraid." He did not deny it. "There is nothing wrong with me," she said quietly. "I just see what is actually there, instead of the story people have decided about you. What is actually there is a man who is tired, and a man who is lonely, and a man who does his job competently but has not yet decided if it is the right job." She paused. "And a man who needs his coffee and probably a decent meal before a long ride tomorrow." He stood very still. Outside, a wagon went by on the street. The bell on the store door was still, and the afternoon light came through the window at an angle that put a long warm stripe across the wooden floor, and Silas Ralston, who had not been at a loss in his own life for a very long time, had absolutely no idea what to do with Violet Monroe. "Mrs. Hargrove makes a good stew," he said finally. "She does," Violet agreed. There was a pause, and then he said carefully, "Would you do me the courtesy of joining me for supper before I ride out tomorrow?" She looked at him for a moment, measuring something. Then she said, "Give me 10 minutes to close up." He waited on the bench outside, feeling something he eventually identified, with some difficulty, as anticipation. And when she came out with her apron off and her hair slightly rearranged and a light shawl over her shoulders, he fell into step beside her and felt, very briefly and very powerfully, like a completely different version of himself. They ate supper and they talked, really talked, in a way he had not talked to anyone in years. She told him about her father, Daniel Monroe, who had been a big, quiet man from Tennessee, who had come west after the war with nothing but a mule and a trade skill, and had built up enough to give his family a decent life before the fever took him. She told him about the general store, which her mother had kept running after his death, and which Violet helped manage now because she had a head for numbers and a memory for what people needed and when they would need it. She told him about the book she was reading, about the choices people made in small ways that turned into the shape of an entire life, and she talked about it with a genuine intellectual engagement that pulled him forward in his seat. He told her things too, not everything. Not the things that still made his jaw tight to think about. But he told her he had grown up in Missouri, that his parents had died when he was 16, that he had made wrong choices in his youth and then made choices to correct those choices, and that bounty work was not what he had planned for his life. It was what he had fallen into because he was good at it, and because being good at something has a gravity of its own. "What did you plan for your life?" she asked. "I did not plan much," he said honestly. "I did not think I would live long enough to need a plan." She looked at him with something that might, in a different light, have been grief on his behalf. "And now I am 28 and I am apparently alive enough to need one," he said. She smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her genuinely smile, not the polite small smile she gave customers, but a real one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face, and he did not know what to do with that either, because it landed in him somewhere that he had thought was entirely closed off and inaccessible. "I think that is grounds for optimism," she said. He walked her back to the house she shared with her mother on the quiet residential street 2 blocks from Maine, a frame house with a garden that was just coming into its spring green, and he stopped at the gate because it was the gate, the appropriate stopping point, and she stopped too and turned to face him. "Silas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and it settled differently than his name usually did when people said it. "Yes," he said. "Come back," she said, not with coyness or drama or the heavy freight of a plea, just directly the way she said everything. "Come back." He looked at her in the fading light, the spring air soft around them, the sound of a dog barking 2 streets over, and the distant noise of the saloon, and the smell of smoke and grass, and the particular twilight smell of the plains that he had always loved even when he loved very little else. "I do not know what I am coming back to," he said. "You are coming back to Caldwell," she said steadily. "The rest can be figured out after that." He nodded. He touched the brim of his hat. He walked back to the hotel. He lay awake again that night staring at the ceiling, and this time he did not bother to tell himself it was pointless. He left at 4 in the morning while the town slept, Cutter moving quiet on the packed dirt of Main Street, the saloon finally dark, the stars enormous overhead. He rode south into the warm Kansas spring with Violet Monroe's voice in his head saying come back, and he thought about choices, and about what a man kept choosing to become. Fletcher Cade was not where the drover had said he was. This was not entirely surprising. Information from drovers was only ever a starting point, a direction rather than a destination. Silas rode into the small settlement called Broken Bow, which was really just a trading post and 4 structures arranged around a muddy yard, and learned from the man at the trading post that Cade had been there but had moved on 2 days ago, heading east toward the Cimarron. He followed the trail east. He was 3 days out of Caldwell before he found fresh sign, and 4 days out before he caught up with Fletcher Cade at a creek crossing, where Cade had made the mistake of stopping to water his horse in the middle of the afternoon. Fletcher Cade was 42, medium height, with a heavy dark beard and the kind of eyes that were always calculating distance and exit points. He went for his gun when he saw Silas, which was what people usually did, and Silas was faster, which was also what usually happened. The gun ended up in the creek, and Cade ended up with his hands bound behind him and considerably less composure than he had started with. "You do not have to do this," Cade said as Silas secured him to his saddle. "Half that money is yours, $8,000. "I do not take deals," Silas said. "Every man takes deals," Cade said. "Not every man," Silas said, and he headed back north. It took him 4 days to get Cade back to Wichita, where the Wells Fargo office received him with visible relief, and paid Silas his $700 in a combination of cash and bank draft. Silas deposited the bank draft, collected the cash, settled his horse at the livery for a day's rest, and found himself standing on a street in Wichita with more money in his pocket than he had had in some time, and the very clear knowledge that he was going to ride back to Caldwell. He examined this knowledge with what he felt was a reasonable degree of skepticism, and concluded that it did not care about his skepticism. He was going back to Caldwell. He spent one night in Wichita and rode south the next morning. The ride back to Caldwell was 80 miles, give or take, and he made it in 2 days with a camp under the stars in between. He thought about what he was doing the entire way and arrived at no particularly rational conclusion, except that Violet Monroe had looked at him and seen something she described as tired and lonely and undecided, and she had been right about all 3 of those things, and he could not remember the last time someone had been right about him. He rode back into Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in mid-May, almost 2 weeks after he had left, and the first person he saw on Main Street was, with a dramatic efficiency that almost made him smile, Violet Monroe, who was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store with the focused attention she gave everything. She looked up at the sound of Cutter's hooves. She stopped sweeping. She looked at him without any particular surprise, as if she had always been confident he would come back, and then she nodded at him once, and the nod contained, if he was reading it correctly, a very contained version of relief. He stopped Cutter at the rail. He climbed down. He took off his hat. "I came back," he said, which was possibly the least impressive sentence he had ever spoken, but it was what came out. "You did," she agreed. She leaned the broom against the wall. "Are you staying a while?" He looked at her. He looked at the town around him, at the school he could see at the end of the cross street and the church tower and the hotel where he had stayed before, at Mrs. Hargrove's restaurant and the livery and the blacksmith's, at a town that was building itself toward something. He thought about Violet Monroe talking about George Eliot and the growing good of the world depending on unhistoric acts. "I think I might be," he said. She picked up her broom. "The hotel is $2 a week now," she said. "Mr. Ackerman raised his rates when the new railroad survey came through." "That is highway robbery," he said. "It is," she agreed entirely seriously, and then she smiled again, that real smile, and he felt it go straight through him, and he thought that perhaps the story he was in had been looking for a different ending than the one he had been heading toward, and here was the turning point, clear as a river crossing. He got his room at the hotel. He had dinner at Mrs. Hargrove's. He had no particular job to do in Caldwell and no particular reason to be there, except the one he was not yet ready to examine out loud, and he found that having no job to do felt strange at first, and then slowly, over the course of several days, started to feel like something else. He started helping. It began without real planning. He was in front of the livery when old Garrett Hicks, who was 73 and had a bad leg from a fall 3 years back, was struggling to get a heavy feed bag up to a height where he could pour it. Silas took the bag without being asked and poured it and handed it back, and Garrett Hicks looked at him with the careful uncertainty of a man who has been told a dog bites and has just had the dog be unexpectedly gentle. "Obliged," Garrett said cautiously. "No trouble," Silas said. "Word got around in a small town." The next day the blacksmith, whose name was Cord Bauer, asked Silas if he could hold a horse that was being difficult, and Silas held the horse, and Cord Bauer afterward nodded at him with a slightly different expression than the one he had been using before. The deacon of the church, a thin, careful man named Deacon Marsh, stopped giving the street a wide berth when Silas was on it. Mrs. Hargrove started giving him a larger portion of stew, and through all of it, Violet Monroe watched with an expression that was not quite pride, not quite satisfaction, but was something in the neighborhood of both. He started walking with her in the evenings. This was not discussed as a thing they were doing. It simply began to happen. He would be near the general store at closing time, and she would come out and they would walk, sometimes toward the creek at the edge of town, sometimes just down the quieter streets, talking in the way they had talked at supper that first evening. He learned more about her. She had wanted to be a teacher once, before her father died, and the practical necessities of her family had redirected her. She had taught herself French from a grammar book because she had wanted to know what it sounded like. She had strong opinions about cattlemen leaving gates open. She read everything she could get her hands on, ordering books from a bookseller in Kansas City and lending them to anyone who would take them, which in Caldwell was not as many people as she would have liked. "You should have been a teacher," he said one evening, sitting on the bank of the creek with the water moving easy and quiet in the dimming light. "I still might be," she said. "Mrs. Patterson, who runs the school, is getting married this summer and moving to Denver. They will need a new teacher in the fall." "You could do it," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You sound very certain." "I am very certain," he said, because he was. He had a good eye for what people were capable of. It was part of his trade, and Violet Monroe had more capability in her quiet, direct way than most people he had ever met. She was quiet for a moment. "Would it bother you," she asked, "if I were here teaching?" He understood what she was asking. She was asking whether he was planning to be somewhere else, and therefore whether any of this mattered. He had been asking himself the same question for the past 10 days. "No," he said. "It would not bother me." She looked at the water. "Then I will apply," she said. He took her hand carefully, because he was careful with things he did not want to break, and she let him. And they sat there on the bank of the creek in Caldwell, Kansas, in May of 1878, with the water going by and the sky turning colors, and it was the quietest and most peaceful and most terrifying thing he had experienced in years. "Silas," she said quietly, not pulling her hand away. "Yes." "What happened to you?" she asked. "I mean, what happened specifically?" "You do not have to tell me, but I think you want to." He was quiet for a long time. A bird called once across the water. Cutter was grazing somewhere behind them, he told her. He told her about his parents, who had died of diphtheria within 2 weeks of each other when he was 16, and left him with nothing and no one. He told her about the years after that, drifting and doing whatever work would take him, some of which he was not proud of. Not criminal exactly, but close enough to criminal in some years that the line had been thin. He told her about a man named Will Castor who had been a bounty hunter and had found 16-year-old Silas in the middle of a very bad situation in a very bad town in Missouri and had, for reasons Silas still did not entirely understand, decided to help him instead of walk past. Will had taken him on and taught him the trade and had been, if he was honest, the closest thing to a father he had had since his own father died. Will had died of a chest wound in Abilene 2 years ago. "After Will," he said, "I kept working because it was what I knew and because I did not have a reason to do anything else." Violet had not moved while he talked. She was still sitting with her hand in his, looking at the water, listening with her whole body. "Until now?" she asked. "Until now," he said, and it was the most honest sentence he could find. She turned to look at him. In the late light her face was all warm shadows and her eyes were very steady and very open. "I am glad you came back," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "You implied it," she said. "You never actually said it." "Then I am saying it now," he said. Retroactively, she laughed, a genuine soft laugh, and he thought he had never heard a better sound. He did not kiss her that evening. He walked her home to the gate of the frame house with its spring garden, and he held her hand until the gate, and then he let it go, and she looked at him with something warm and questioning and patient in her expression, and he said good night, and she said good night, and he walked back to the hotel feeling something that he eventually, carefully, identified as happiness, which was an emotion he had not spent much time with. He kissed her 3 evenings later at the same creek, after a conversation about whether the stars in Kansas were more or less visible than the stars in Missouri, which was the kind of conversation that sounded trivial and was not, because it was really about whether 2 different kinds of lives could find a common geography. He kissed her and she kissed him back without any hesitation, her hands coming up to his chest, and it was gentle and it was serious, and it was entirely different from anything he could remember. When they separated, she pressed her forehead briefly against his jaw, and he put his arm around her and they stood there by the creek, and the night was enormous and full of stars, Kansas stars, which he conceded were very good. June came to Caldwell with a heat that pressed down on everything and made the cattle drives more irritable than usual. The saloon had a regular fight at least twice a week, and the sheriff, a stocky, experienced man named Sheriff Dale Whitmore, was kept busy enough that he started having more civil conversations with Silas, who he had initially regarded with the professional wariness of a man who understood reputations. Whitmore eventually said to him, one morning when they were both getting coffee from Mrs. Hargrove, "You are not what I expected." "People rarely are," Silas said. "Violet Monroe's influence," Whitmore said, with the calm certainty of a man who had been watching his town for a long time. Silas did not confirm or deny this, but he did not deny it. Clara Monroe invited him to Sunday dinner. He understood the weight of this invitation. Clara Monroe was a sensible woman who loved her daughter and had raised her alone for 4 years, and was not going to let any person of unclear character sit at her table without measuring them carefully. He accepted with appropriate gravity. The Sunday dinner was pot roast, which Clara Monroe made excellently, and cornbread and green beans from the early garden. The three of them sat around the table in the small, bright kitchen, and Clara asked him questions with the direct practicality of a woman who did not believe in dancing around important matters. "What are your intentions in Caldwell?" she asked, while passing the cornbread. "I am trying to determine whether I belong here," he said, because Clara Monroe was the kind of woman who would know if he lied, and because honesty seemed like the only reasonable approach. "And," she said. He looked briefly at Violet, who was watching him with that contained expression. "And I believe I do," he said. Clara Monroe looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she said, "You will need honest work." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Sheriff Whitmore has been looking for a deputy," she said. "The last one lasted 3 months before deciding he would rather work cattle. He had not known this." He looked at Violet. "I did not tell her to say that," Violet said. "I know things," Clara said calmly. "Eat your pot roast." He talked to Sheriff Whitmore the following morning, and the conversation had the quality of two practical men discussing a practical thing, without unnecessary ceremony. Whitmore was in his late 40s, had been sheriff of Caldwell for 6 years, had 2 deputies already, one of whom was reliable and one of whom was young and still learning, and was looking for someone who could handle the kind of situations that arose in a cattle town on the Kansas Indian Territory border without making them worse. "You have a reputation," Whitmore said. "I am aware," Silas said. "In Caldwell that reputation goes 2 ways," Whitmore said. "Some people will respect it. Some people will want to test it." "I know how to handle both," Silas said. "I expect you do," Whitmore said. "I am going to offer you deputy work. $25 a month in meals when you are on a long patrol. You work under my authority and you follow my rules, which are that we solve things without shooting them if at all possible, and that we treat everyone in this town, drover or homesteader or otherwise, with equal fairness." "I can do that," Silas said. "I know you have bounty work pending," Whitmore said. "I have decided to finish what is outstanding and not take new contracts," Silas said, and he had decided this in the last 30 seconds, and it felt like the right decision. Whitmore looked at him steadily. "Because of Violet Monroe," he said. Silas met his gaze. "In part," he said. "In enough part." Whitmore extended his hand. "Welcome to Caldwell," he said. He told Violet that evening at the creek, which had become their place in the way that places became people's places without anyone formally designating them. She listened to him talk about the conversation with Whitmore, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. "Scared," he said, because she had been nothing but honest with him and he could do no less. "I have been moving for 12 years. I do not entirely know how to stop." "I know," she said. She took his hand. "But you are doing it anyway." "I am doing it anyway," he agreed. She rested her head on his shoulder in that way she had started doing in the last week, comfortable and unhurried. And he thought about what she had said that very first real day, about people becoming what they kept choosing to become. And he thought that he was choosing now, every day, choosing in small ways that were adding up to something. And he was not scared of that exactly. He was just very aware of the weight of it. July brought a problem. The problem's name was Frank Decker, and he was the younger brother of two of the men Silas had killed in Wichita 18 months ago. He came into Caldwell with 4 men at his back on a hot Thursday afternoon and asked around for Silas Ralston with the particular tone of a man who had been carrying a grievance for a long time and had decided today was the day to put it down. Silas was doing deputy work on the north end of town when Harold at the saloon sent a boy to find him. He came south on Main Street and found Frank Decker standing outside the hotel with his 4 men spread out behind him, and the street emptied out the way streets emptied out when something like this was about to happen. Violet was not on the street. He noted this with something that was relief and something that was missing her steadiness, and then he put both aside because Frank Decker was speaking. Ralston, Decker said. He was maybe 30, lean and hard-faced, with a gun on each hip that he wore with the comfort of a man who had used them. "You killed my brothers." "Your brothers were shooting at me," Silas said. He stopped 10 feet from Decker, relaxed in the way that men who have been in many dangerous situations learn to be relaxed, because tension is slower than calm. "They drew first." "That is not how I heard it told," Decker said. "Then you heard it wrong," Silas said. "I do not make a habit of shooting men who are not shooting at me." Sheriff Whitmore had come up somewhere to his left, he could sense it. The reliable deputy, a man named Tom Ferris, was on the other side of the street. "I came for satisfaction," Decker said. "I understand that," Silas said. "Losing brothers is a hard thing. I am sorry for your loss. But those men made choices that put them in front of my gun, and satisfaction is not something I can give you because it would require me to be something I am not willing to be anymore." Decker stared at him. The 4 men behind him were very still. "What does that mean?" Decker said. "It means I am a deputy of this town," Silas said, "and you are welcome to take your business to the law. If your brothers were killed wrongly, there are courts. If you came here for a gunfight, I am telling you plainly that I will not be drawn. I have work to do and people here who matter to me, and I am not going to end that or your life over a grudge, however real your grief is." There was a long silence, the kind of silence that either breaks one way or another. One of Decker's 4 men said quietly, "Frank, he is wearing a deputy star. This is not what we came for." Frank Decker looked at Silas for a long time. Something moved across his face, something complicated, and then he said, "You are different from what I expected." "I get that a lot," Silas said. Decker looked at the star on Silas's chest. He looked at Whitmore and Ferris. He looked at the empty street. "My brothers are still dead," he said. "Yes," Silas said quietly. "They are, and I cannot change that." Another long pause. Then Decker reached slowly into his vest pocket, and Silas was very still, and Decker pulled out a folded piece of paper, which he looked at and then folded again and put away. "There is money owed to my family by a man in this town," he said. "A debt my brother Pete had outstanding. That is actually why we are here." The tension, which had been a wire about to snap, eased by about half. "Who is the man?" Whitmore asked, stepping forward. It turned out to be a legitimate land dispute that had been buried under the more dramatic framing of Decker's grief and his need to confront Silas, and Whitmore spent the next 2 hours sorting it out with considerably less violence than anyone had been bracing for. Decker and his men left before sundown, the paper dispute resolved at least partially to everyone's dissatisfaction, which was usually the best outcome for those things. Tom Ferris clapped Silas on the shoulder afterward. "That was well handled," he said. Whitmore said nothing, but he gave Silas a nod that meant the same thing. Silas went to find Violet. She was at the house, in the garden, pulling weeds in the late afternoon, because she had clearly heard what was happening and chosen to stay out of the way, which was its own kind of faith in him. And when she looked up and saw him coming through the gate, she stood up straight and came to him, and he held on to her for a long moment, and she held him back, and neither of them said anything, and it was enough. "I was not afraid," she said eventually into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I was not afraid for you either," she said. in the sense of panicking. But I was afraid in the sense of caring what happened. That is a different kind of afraid, he said. A much better kind, she agreed. He stepped back and looked at her. There was a smear of garden dirt on her cheek and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she had never in his entire acquaintance with her looked anything less than entirely herself, and he was suddenly, absolutely sure. I love you, he said, because he was not a man who believed in saving things for a more convenient moment. Convenient moments were not reliable. She looked at him. The dirt was still on her cheek. The light was doing that late afternoon gold thing it did on the Kansas plains that made everything look like something important was happening. I know, she said, and then she smiled, and then she said, I love you too, Silas. I think I have since you did not know what to do with the fact that I was not afraid of you. You looked so completely disarmed. I was, he said. Good, she said, and stood up on her toes and kissed him. He asked her mother formally, 2 Sundays later, sitting at the table after dinner, while Violet was washing up dishes in the kitchen, and pretending very unconvincingly that she could not hear every word through the open door. Clara Monroe listened to him say that he loved her daughter and intended to ask her to marry him and wanted to do so with her blessing, and she looked at him for the full length of the pause that followed, and then she said, My daughter has better judgment than anyone I know. She decided you were worth knowing before anyone else in this town did, and she has not been wrong about a person yet. She folded her hands on the table. You have my blessing, Silas. Be good to her. Yes, ma'am, he said. I intend to be for the rest of my life. From the kitchen came the very distinct sound of a dish being set down somewhat more firmly than was strictly necessary, followed by complete silence, and Silas had to work hard not to smile. He proposed at the creek. He had bought the ring from a jeweler in Wichita on a courier trip he had made on behalf of the sheriff's office, a simple gold band with a small garnet that had reminded him of the warm brown of her eyes, which was not a comparison he made out loud because it sounded overwrought even in his own head. He had been carrying it in his vest pocket for 4 days, which felt a bit like carrying a small son around. They were sitting at their usual spot, late August by now, the evening cooling down from the day's heat, the creek running lower than it had in spring. He had been holding the ring in his pocket for the entire walk and was now in the situation of needing to do the thing. You are distracted, she said. I am, he agreed. She looked at him sideways. Something on your mind? Several things, he said. She waited. She was excellent at waiting. It was one of the things about her that had undone him consistently since the first day. He turned toward her and took the ring out of his pocket and held it in his palm, and she looked at it and then looked at him, and he saw something happen in her expression, a softening and a brightening at the same time, like a window opened. Violet, he said, I have been alone for 12 years and I did not know how wrong that was until you stood on a street and looked at me like I was a person instead of a problem. You changed the direction I was going just by being yourself. I do not know how to be the man I want to be without knowing you are in it with me. Will you marry me? She did not make him wait. Yes, she said, immediately and completely, and she held out her hand and he put the ring on her finger and she looked at it and then looked at him with everything she was right there in her face, unguarded and entirely certain. Yes, she said again, and she kissed him. And the creek went on past them, and the Kansas evening was soft around them, and it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. They were married in October, in the church with the bell tower, on a morning when the Kansas sky was the particular impossible blue it goes in autumn, clear and deep and enormous. Clara Monroe wore her good dress and cried in the precise, contained way of a woman who had decided she was going to cry and was going to do it correctly. Garrett Hicks came, and Sheriff Whitmore and Tom Farris and most of the town, and Harold from the saloon stood in the back looking slightly uncomfortable but present. Mrs. Hargrove made a cake that was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. Deacon Marsh said the words. Violet wore a cream-colored dress that Clara had been altering for 2 months, with a focused secrecy that Silas had found both touching and amusing. Silas wore the closest thing to a good suit he owned, which he had acquired in Wichita on the same trip that had produced the ring, dark wool that fit him well enough that Tom Ferris had made a surprised noise when he saw it. When the deacon got to the part about promising to love and cherish, Silas looked at Violet and felt the enormous quiet weight of choosing. This choice, this woman, this life. It did not feel like giving anything up. It felt like arriving somewhere. "I do," he said, and meant every syllable. "I do," Violet said, and she was looking at him with absolute clarity, no fear and no hesitation and no holding back. And he thought that this was the most extraordinary thing about her, that she gave herself to things entirely, that she decided what mattered and then gave it everything. He was going to spend the rest of his life being worth that. The bell rang. People cheered in the way small towns cheer, genuinely and with the warmth of community, and Clara Monroe pressed her handkerchief against her eyes with dignified composure, and Garrett Hicks clapped his hands together with the enthusiasm of a man for whom joy is earned and therefore appreciated. And Mrs. Hargrove already had a hand on the cake. They had a small house. He had bought it in September with the saved bounty money and the deputy wages, a frame house 4 streets from Clara Monroe with a sitting room and 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a front porch that looked out over a quiet street with a cottonwood tree that went gold in October. He had spent 3 weeks repairing everything that needed repairing, which was quite a lot, and Violet had spent those 3 weeks choosing where things would go with the quiet authority of a woman who knew exactly what a home was supposed to feel like. She had gotten the teaching position. Mrs. Patterson had indeed married and moved to Denver in August, and Violet had applied in July and been given the job by the school board with a unanimity that suggested they recognized what they were getting. She started in September with 16 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she came home in the afternoons with the full and satisfied expression of a person doing what they were supposed to be doing. Edmund Cooper finally understood long division, she told him one evening in October, her feet tucked up under her on the settee, her hair down after the day, a cup of tea in her hands. I could see the exact moment it became clear to him. It was like watching a lamp come on. He was sitting across from her reading the newspaper, which was a thing he had started doing because he was in a town now and a town meant being informed about it, and he lowered the paper to watch her talk about Edmund Cooper and long division. "You love it," he said. "I love it so much," she said, and she smiled at him over her cup. "Are you reading about the railroad survey?" "I am reading about the railroad survey," he said. "Whitmore wants a meeting with the town council about what it will mean for the cattle traffic. More money through town," she said thoughtfully. "More people. More work for the sheriff's office," he said. She looked at him. "Are you going to stay with it?" "The deputy work." He folded the newspaper and set it down. "What would you think," he said, "if I stayed with it but also put in for the marshal examination? There is a federal appointment being made in the district next year." She tilted her head, considering him, not calculating what it would mean for her, he knew. She was thinking about what it meant for him, which was characteristic. "I think you would be very good at it," she said. "And I think you would be applying for the right reasons because you want to build something, not because you need to prove something." "Yes," he said. "Then you should apply," she said. "And I think you should have talked to Whitmore first, but I suspect you already have." He had talked to Whitmore yesterday morning, and Whitmore had said he would write the recommendation himself and meant it. "I have," he admitted. "Then it is already happening," she said contentedly, and took a sip of her tea. He got up from his chair and came to sit beside her on the settee, and she leaned against him with the ease of a woman who has found where she fits, and they sat together in their house on the quiet street, while the cottonwood dropped the last of its gold leaves outside, and Caldwell settled into its evening, and a life that he had not known how to plan for was turning out to be worth all the planning in the world. November brought the first real cold and the end of the cattle season, and Caldwell quieted down to its winter self, which was an entirely different kind of town from the summer version. The drovers went home to Texas, and the saloon reduced its hours and Main Street was navigable without having to step around anyone, and Silas found that he preferred the quieter version. He continued his deputy work through the winter, which in a quiet season meant mostly dispute resolution, a fence line argument here, a debt collection issue there, the occasional intoxicated traveler who needed a night to reconsider his choices. He studied for the martial examination with the focused method he brought to things that mattered to him, reading the federal statutes and the procedure manuals that Whitmore had acquired over the years, asking questions, sitting in on the circuit judge's court when it came through in December. Violet read beside him in the evenings. She was always reading something, usually with a student in mind, some way to make history or grammar or arithmetic come alive for a 14-year-old who would rather be anywhere else. They read in companionable silence, occasionally reading things aloud to each other, and Silas thought that this was a kind of intimacy he had never anticipated, this shared quietness, this being in the same room and the same life. He told her things about his past, piece by piece, not all at once but in the natural way that people tell each other things when they trust each other. She never reacted with horror or with the particular hunger for dark details that some people had. She listened and asked careful questions and sometimes said very little, and sometimes said the exact right thing, and she absorbed him as he was, completely, which was a thing he had not known he had been hoping for. She told him things, too, about the years after her father died, when money had been very tight, and there had been months when Clara had sold her own things to keep the store going. About a man in town who had courted her 2 years ago and whom she had not loved and had told so plainly, and who had taken the rejection poorly and said unkind things, and how that had been harder than she had let anyone see, because she was always the one who appeared not to be affected by things. About her loneliness in Caldwell sometimes, surrounded by people she liked but not always people who understood her. "I understood you from the first day," he said. "You were confused by me from the first day," she said. "Both things can be true," he said. She laughed. "Yes," she said, "both things can be true." January of 1879 was cold and clear and still, and Violet Monroe, who was now Violet Ralston, though she kept Monroe for the school because the children were used to it, discovered in the second week of January that she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning. She was very calm, as she was about most things, but there was something in her eyes that was large with the weight of it, with wonder and some nervousness and a great deal of feeling. He sat very still for a moment after she told him because he was processing something enormous, and then he stood up and took her face in his hands and looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am more than very well." "Good," he said. "Then I will be too." He kissed her forehead and then both her hands, and she laughed a little, surprised by the formality of it, and then she leaned into him. "A baby," she said softly. "A baby," he agreed, and something in his chest opened up like a room he had never known was there. Clara Monroe received the news with a quality of joy that was more powerful for being quiet, the joy of a woman who had spent years working hard and worrying and getting through, who had arrived at something tender and good. She held Violet's face in her hands for a long moment and did not say anything, and did not need to. That winter and spring Silas was also, quietly and with considerable focus, thinking about the town. Not just his work in it, but the town itself, the issues underneath the surface of daily life. Caldwell was growing. The railroad survey had become a reality, and the Kansas City, Lawrence and Southern Kansas Railroad was coming through, which meant the town would change significantly. More businesses, more people, more money, and inevitably more complications. He had noticed things in his deputy work that he thought about seriously. The way the Indian Territory border created a complicated jurisdiction that led to injustices on both sides. Men who came across the line and were treated as inherently suspect. People whose land rights were murky because the documentation was old or missing. a community of recently freed black families who had settled 2 miles outside of town, who received considerably less attention from the law when they needed it and considerably more scrutiny when they did not. He talked to Whitmore about this. Whitmore listened with the attention of a man who had thought about it himself. "The law is supposed to apply equally," Whitmore said. "I believe that, but believing it and making it happen in a town like this in this year are two different things." "I know," Silas said. "But we can do more than we have been doing." The Caldwell community, the Simmons family, and the others out east of town, they called for help twice last year, and one of those times a deputy got there 2 days late. "That is not acceptable," Whitmore said. "No," Silas said, "it is not. They made changes. Small ones, the only kind you could make in 1879 in southern Kansas, but real ones. More regular patrol of the East Road. A genuine response policy that did not have different time standards for different parts of the community." Silas made a point of being present and respectful and treating the Simmons family and their neighbors the way he treated every other family in the district. And over time, slowly, cautiously, they began to take him at his word. James Simmons, who was the unofficial community leader, a man in his 40s who had been born into slavery and had made himself into a farmer of real skill since emancipation, shook Silas's hand one spring day with the measured respect of a man who does not give that lightly. "You are different from what I expected," James said. "I get that a lot," Silas said, and James Simmons looked at him and smiled a small, dry smile. Violet, when he told her about this, said, "I am proud of you," without any qualification, and he knew she meant it. Spring came to Caldwell with the same extravagance it always did, green coming up everywhere at once, the creek running high and clear, the sky that particular soft blue of Kansas in April. Violet was visibly expecting by April, and she continued teaching until June with the straightforward intention of a woman who saw no reason to stop doing her work until she had to. The school board had an opinion about this which she discussed with them plainly, and which was resolved in a way that left the board somewhat surprised by the firmness of their own agreement. She was 6 months along and still carrying the school's attendance records home on Friday afternoons to reconcile over the weekend. "You do not have to do that," Silas said. "I know I do not have to," she said pleasantly. "I want to." "You are allowed to rest," he said. "I am resting," she said. "This is sitting down." He could not argue with this. She stopped teaching in late June because her replacement, a young man named Arthur Cole who had come from a teaching college in Ohio, arrived and needed to be oriented, and she spent 3 days walking him through the school, the students, the curriculum, and the particular challenges and gifts of every child in the room, with the thoroughness of a person handing over something they love to someone else's care. She came home from the last day of that looking quietly sad, and he sat with her on the porch while the summer evening settled around them. "He will be good," she said about Arthur Cole. "He is earnest and he cares about the children. He will be good." "You can go back in the fall," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not sad about leaving. I'm just sad in the way that you get sad when something that has mattered to you changes, even if it is changing for a good reason." "I understand that," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. His hand rested on the curve of her middle, and from inside came the movement that still amazed him, the small, insistent presence of someone who did not yet exist in the world but was very much on their way. "I am not afraid," she said, and she did not specify of what because she did not need to. "I know you are not," he said. "Are you?" she asked. He thought about it honestly because she deserved honesty. "A little," he said, "in the best possible way." She turned her head to look at him and smiled. "Good," she said. "A much better kind of afraid." Their son was born on a hot July morning in 1879, a healthy and loud and immediately opinionated baby who arrived with the confident energy of someone who had decided the world was going to be interesting. Silas was there, which was not typical for the time but which he had been absolutely fixed on being regardless of convention, and he held his son for the first time while Violet rested, and looked down at this small new face and felt something restructure itself inside him, permanently and entirely. "He is loud," he said, in a reverent kind of wonder. "He is mine," Violet said from the bed, with the exhausted satisfaction of a woman who has done something enormous. "Come here." He brought the baby to her, and she took him and held him against her and looked at him with that complete attention she gave to things that mattered. And the room was quiet except for the baby's sounds, and the summer morning was coming in through the window. And Silas Ralston sat on the edge of the bed beside his wife and his son, and felt the full weight of a life that had become, somehow, exactly the right size. They named him Daniel for her father. Daniel Ralston arrived in the world and immediately set about making his presence felt. He was a robust and curious baby who slept in unexpected intervals and had strong opinions about most things. Silas was equal parts terrified and delighted by him, which Violet found quietly hilarious. "You have held killers at gunpoint without flinching," she said one morning in August, while he was attempting to accomplish a feeding-adjacent activity that was not going well. "Killers do not wiggle like this," he said with great dignity. She laughed and came to help, and they managed it together, and Daniel Ralston regarded them both with the ancient philosophical calm of a recently fed baby. "He looks like you," Violet said. "He looks like you," Silas said. "He looks like himself," she said, "which is what I hoped for." The fall of 1879 settled over Caldwell with the particular golden weight of a year that has been good. The railroad was coming, the survey work had been finalized, and the town was planning with the energy of a place that believes in its future. Silas had taken the federal marshal examination in September, ridden 2 days to the examination site in Wichita, and come back with the quiet confidence of a man who had prepared well. The appointment would take months, but Whitmore had seen the examination questions and said he expected no difficulty. Violet went back to teaching in September, bringing Daniel to Clara Monroe each morning, who received this arrangement with the obvious delight of a grandmother who has been hoping for exactly this since July. Daniel took to his grandmother's house with equanimity. He was, everyone agreed, a very sensible baby. Life had a rhythm now, the rhythm of 2 people who have built something real together and are living inside it. Mornings with Daniel and coffee and the planning of the day. Violet's walk to her mother's and then to the school. Silas's work at the sheriff's office, which had grown to include more administrative work as the town grew, and which he found unexpectedly absorbing. Evenings on the porch when the weather allowed, talking about the day, about the town, about the books she was reading, about the federal law questions he was studying, about Daniel's new achievements, which were reported with a precision that would have been amusing to anyone who did not know that Violet Monroe brought that precision to everything she genuinely loved. One October evening, sitting on the porch with Daniel asleep inside and the cottonwood yellow in the yard and the first real cool of autumn in the air, Violet said, "I want to write about this." "About what?" he said. "About here," she said. "About what it actually is to live in a place like this in this time. People write stories about the West that are all about violence and drama, and it is not like that. It is mostly ordinary and beautiful and hard in the ordinary ways life is hard." She paused. "I think I would like to write about that." He looked at her. "You should," he said. "You think so. You have thought about things clearly your entire life," he said. "You should write them down." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard. "I told my father once that I wanted to be a writer when I was about 11. He said that was a fine thing to want, and that I should want it even harder and then do it." "He sounds like he would have been worth knowing," Silas said. "He would have liked you," she said. "He respected people who chose to be better than their circumstances." Silas looked at the cottonwood going gold in the evening light. "I had a lot of bad circumstances to be better than," he said. "You were better than all of them," she said. He turned and looked at her, his wife with her book in her lap and the baby asleep inside and the town around them that he had helped to keep and that had, in some way that he still found slightly improbable, kept him back, kept him in one place, kept him becoming the thing he was choosing to become. "Because of you," he said. "No," she said firmly and kindly. "Because of you. I did not do anything except refuse to be afraid of you, which was never a sacrifice because there was never anything to be afraid of. The rest was all you." He wanted to argue with this and knew she would win the argument, which was always the case when she had decided something was true, so he let it go. He reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his. The federal marshal appointment came in December of 1879, and with it, a new set of responsibilities and a new territory that was considerably larger than Caldwell, covering a substantial swath of southern Kansas, and requiring a level of organization and administration that he threw himself into with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to anything he decided mattered. Whitmore was, he understood, genuinely proud with the unsentimental satisfaction of a mentor who has watched a person become themselves. "You have done something real here," Whitmore said, on the day the appointment was official, shaking his hand with both of his. "I want you to know I see that." "I had help," Silas said. "You had a wife who saw you clearly," Whitmore said. "That is a particular kind of help." Spring came to Caldwell in 1880, and the railroad arrived with it, the first train coming through in April with a great deal of noise and civic celebration, and the town that had always been about cattle found itself suddenly about several things at once, which meant growth and opportunity and complication in equal measure. Silas's work as marshal took on new dimensions. The railroad brought lawyers and businessmen, and a new class of dispute that was less about guns and more about paper, and he found that his instinct for resolving things without violence was serving him well in ways he had not anticipated. Violet continued teaching and continued writing in the evenings, filling notebooks with her careful observations about this place and this time, and sometimes reading passages to him that made him see things he had been looking at every day completely differently. "You see the world so clearly," he told her one evening after she had read him a passage about the way the light fell on Main Street in the summer evenings, the way the dust moved, the particular orange of the sunset over the flat horizon. "I pay attention," she said. "You taught me that, not directly, but you did. I taught you to pay attention. Watching you be a person," she said. "You pay attention to everything. I think I became more deliberate about it after I met you." He was surprised by this. "I thought it was the other way around." "It goes both ways," she said. "That is the thing about people who love each other properly. They make each other more themselves, not less." He thought about that for a long time afterward. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1881, and they named her Eleanor, which had been Silas's mother's name, a fact he had mentioned once in passing, and which Violet had held onto with the same careful attention she held onto everything about him. She came into the world with Violet's eyes and Silas's quiet watchfulness, and almost immediately a decided personality that her 2-year-old brother Daniel found both impressive and slightly alarming. Daniel, who was by now a walking, talking, thoroughly opinionated individual with a habit of asking questions that were more penetrating than anyone expected from a 2-year-old, looked at his new sister in Clara Monroe's arms and said, with great seriousness, "She is watching everything." "Like her father," Clara Monroe said, looking at Silas. "Like her mother," Silas said, looking at Violet, who was sitting up in bed with the satisfied expression of a woman who has done something enormous and knows it. "Like herself," Violet said, in the same tone she had used about Daniel, and reached out her arms. Caldwell grew and Silas grew with it. The federal work was demanding, and sometimes took him away from home for days at a time, which he disliked, and which he and Violet navigated with the practicality they brought to hard things. He always came home. He always told her where he was going, and when he expected to be back, and he kept to those promises with the stubbornness of a man who understands that reliability is not a small thing, but is in fact the architecture of trust. She missed him and told him so plainly, and he missed her in a way that had become part of the fabric of being away from home, a persistent awareness of her absence that made coming back something to move toward rather than simply a return. He had been in Caldwell 4 years when he stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom one morning, buttoning his good shirt, and looked at himself, and thought that he did not entirely recognize this person, not in the way of someone who had lost himself, but in the way of someone who had found a version of themselves they had not known was available. Violet came into the room behind him, Daniel in tow, a leaner on her hip, and she met his eyes in the mirror with that direct, clear gaze she had given him from the first day on the street. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking I do not know how I got here," he said. "You rode in on a horse," she said with complete composure, "and I was not afraid of you, and you had no idea what to do about that." "No," he said, "I did not." She came to stand beside him at the mirror, a leaner still on her hip, Daniel holding onto her skirt and looking at his own reflection with the absorbed interest of a child who finds himself fascinating, and she looked at Silas in the glass. "Do you know now," she said, "what to do about it?" He turned from the mirror to look at her directly, the way she always looked at him. "Yes," he said. "What do you do about it?" she asked, and she was smiling, that real smile. "You love her," he said. "As well as you possibly can, for as long as you have, and you do not take a single day of it for granted." Alina, who was 8 months old and had no opinion yet on romantic speeches, reached out and grabbed his shirt collar with confident authority. Daniel said "Papa," with the frequency of a child who has discovered that the word produces a reliable and satisfying response. Violet looked at him across their children with everything she was and everything they had built and said, "Yes. That is exactly what you do." Clara Monroe came for Sunday dinner every week without fail for years, bringing bread or a pie or garden herbs, and she watched her grandchildren grow with the deep, quiet pleasure of a woman who had worked hard and feared and grieved, and arrived finally at joy. She and Silas developed a particular relationship of their own, a mutual respect that had grown from that first formal Sunday dinner into something warmer and more real, the relationship of two people who love the same person and understand each other because of it. She told him once, in the garden one afternoon while Violet was inside and the children were playing, "I was not sure about you at the beginning." "I know," he said. "I was wrong to be unsure," she said. "Not because you did not have a difficult history, but because Violet has never been wrong about a person's essential character. I should have trusted her judgment faster than I did." "You were protecting her," he said. "That is what a mother does." Clara Monroe looked at him, and her expression was full of something he had not often seen directed at him, something uncomplicated and warm. "You are a good man, Silas Ralston," she said. "My daughter knew it before the rest of us, but we all got there in the end." He did not know what to say to that, so he helped her with the garden, which was also the right thing. The years settled into themselves the way years do when a life is finally shaped right, not without difficulty or hardship, because nothing was without those things, but with the underlying sense of rightness that comes when two people have found each other and understood what they found. Caldwell grew, and the Marshals' work grew with it, and Silas navigated a changing territory with the steady competence of a man who has committed to understanding what justice actually requires rather than just what is convenient. Violet's teaching continued and her writing grew, and a piece she wrote about frontier life was published in a Kansas City newspaper in 1883 and then again in an anthology of Western writing, and she received a letter from an editor in New York who wanted to know if she had more. She came home with the letter and handed it to Silas without a word, and he read it and handed it back and said, "Write more." "I do not know what to write," she said. "You know exactly what to write," he said. "Write what you see, write about this place honestly, write about what it costs and what it is worth." She looked at the letter. "It would take time, more time than I have easily." "Then we make more time," he said. "Daniel is old enough for more responsibility at home. Alina will be in school next year. Your mother can help in the afternoons. We will figure it out." She looked at him with the expression that he had come to think of as the one she kept for things that moved her, the one that was equal parts gratitude and certainty. "You want this for me," she said. "I want everything for you," he said. "All of it. Everything you are capable of, which is more than you have had room for. Make room, Violet. I will help you make room." She wrote the book. It took 3 years, written in pieces in the evenings and on Sunday afternoons and in the summer mornings before the heat set in. And when it was done, it was a true and beautiful account of life on the southern Kansas frontier. Not romanticized and not harsh, but honest. The way she was honest, seeing what was actually there. It was published in 1886 by a small press in Kansas City, and it was reviewed admiringly in 3 newspapers, and it made its way to readers who wrote letters about it. She read him the letters in the evenings, sitting on the porch, the children older now. Daniel, a serious and perceptive 7-year-old who read everything he could find. Alina, a bright and determined 5-year-old who had her mother's eyes and her father's alertness, and both of their stubbornness, in a combination that suggested a very interesting life ahead of her. There was a night in September of 1886 when the children were in bed and the air had turned cool, and the stars were doing their Kansas thing, enormous and particular and real. And Silas and Violet sat on the porch with a lamp between them, and she was reading one of the letters, a long one from a woman in Ohio who had grown up on the frontier and said that the book had made her understand her own life better. And Violet's voice was quiet and steady and full. She finished the letter and set it down. He reached over and took her hand. "You did something real," he said. "We did something real," she said. "The book was yours," he said. "The life was ours," she said. "And the life is what the book is about." He looked out at the street, at the cottonwood that had gone gold again, at the town he could see a piece of at the end of their street, at the small square of light from Clara Monroe's house 2 blocks away, at the darkness of the Kansas plains beyond the town where the stars were thickest. "I came into this town," he said, "and everyone ran, and you stood there with your apples and looked at me like I was nothing to be afraid of." "You were nothing to be afraid of," she said. "I was something to be afraid of," he said. "I just was not something you needed to be afraid of. There is a difference." "There is," she agreed. "And you knew which one you were, underneath all the rest of it." He thought about the 16-year-old boy who had survived by moving fast and staying hard and not letting anything land. He thought about Will Castor pulling him out of a bad situation in Missouri and giving him a direction. He thought about riding into Caldwell with the intention of leaving quickly and the one person in town who looked at him directly. "You saved my life," he said. "Not dramatically, not by doing anything specific. Just by looking at me and seeing a person instead of a story." Violet was quiet for a moment. "You were always a person," she said. "You were just waiting for someone to wait long enough to see it." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the lamp burned between them, and the September night was cool and clear and full of stars, and the town that he had come to passing through and had never left was quiet around them. "I am glad I came back," he said. "I am glad you came back," she agreed. "I always knew you would." "How did you know?" he said. She turned her head to look at him, and in the lamplight her face was exactly as it had been on the street that first day, direct and steady and entirely unafraid. "Because you are the kind of man who keeps his word," she said. "And you said you would be back. You implied it very clearly." He laughed, quiet and real, and she laughed with him. And inside the house Daniel turned over in his sleep and Alina made a sound, and the lamp light was warm on the porch. And Caldwell, Kansas, was a good place to be in September of 1886. He kissed her temple, and she settled closer, and the cottonwood moved in the evening air, and it was exactly enough, which was to say it was everything. He had come into town as the man everyone was afraid of, and she had stood on the street with her apples and not been afraid, and he had not known what to do with that, not at first. And then slowly, and then all at once, he had understood that what you did with someone who saw you clearly was you let yourself be seen. You stopped moving long enough to be found. You chose, in small ways that added up to the whole shape of a life, to become what you wanted to be rather than what you had been. You built something with someone who believed in the building, and you came back. You always came back. Because she was waiting, and she was not afraid, and there was nothing in the world better than being known by someone who looked at you the way Violet Monroe Ralston looked at Silas Ralston, clearly and completely and without a single flinch. He looked at the stars for a long while. She fell asleep against his shoulder, the letter still in her hand. He stayed awake a while longer, holding her, watching the stars, feeling the weight and the warmth of the life they had made. Then he folded her carefully in from the cool air and carried the lamp inside and left the door open a crack so the night air came through, and went to check on the children, who were sleeping the deep, impractical sleep of children who have no particular worries, and he stood for a moment in the doorway of their room, watching them breathe. Daniel had one arm flung over his head. Eleanor had pulled every blanket she possessed into a nest arrangement. He tucked Eleanor's blankets back into an arrangement that would still be there in an hour, which it would not, and smoothed Daniel's hair, and went back to the bedroom where Violet was curled under the quilt, and he lay down beside her in the dark. She turned toward him in her sleep, the way she always did. He put his arm around her. Outside, Caldwell was dark and quiet, the railroad tracks gleaming faintly at the edge of town, the saloon closed, the church tower visible against the stars. In the morning there would be work and children and school, and the business of a town that was still growing into itself. And there would be coffee on the stove and Violet's voice asking what he was thinking, and Daniel asking penetrating questions, and Eleanor conducting her morning investigations of everything within reach. There would be all of it, all the ordinary sacred daily things that a man who had spent 12 years moving and not stopping had not known he was missing until he stopped. He closed his eyes. He slept.